My name is Ella Willoughby, and at 17, as I sit here by the window, watching the soft autumn light filter through the leaves of the old oak in my grandparents' garden, I often find myself drifting back. I am, and have always been, the sole child of my parents, two people who, for the longest time, wrapped my world in a cocoon of warmth and affection. Growing up in our sun-dappled house on Maple Street in the town of Havenwood, I truly believed I was the luckiest child alive. Every bedtime story, every shared laugh, every comforting hug was a thread in the beautiful tapestry of my early life. But perceptions, like the seasons, can change, and mine began a slow, almost imperceptible shift during one particular incident when I was in the 8th grade, a quiet whisper that would eventually grow into a storm. It was a crisp October afternoon. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth hung in the air as I walked out of the red brick gates of Havenwood Middle School. My backpack felt heavy with books and the usual teenage anxieties, but my mind was already leaping ahead to the warmth of home and my mother's gentle smile. That's when I saw her, a woman standing by the old sycamore tree near the gate, a splash of unnatural vibrancy against the muted autumn colors. She was all sharp angles and bright hues, her platinum blonde hair catching the weak sunlight like a beacon. Oversized sunglasses, the kind that hid more than they revealed, perched on her nose. She caught my eye, and a loud, slightly brassy voice called out, "You must be Ella, right?" I froze, my hand clutching the strap of my backpack. My heart gave a startled little thump. Back in my first year of elementary school, dear Mrs. Gable, with her kind eyes and lavender-scented cardigans, had drilled 3 key phrases into our impressionable minds: don't go, don't ride, shout, run away and inform. It was our first, earnest lesson in self-protection, words etched into the bedrock of my memory. They echoed in my head now, a faint, insistent chime. "Oh, did I scare you, sweetie?" "It's all right," the woman said, her voice dripping with an almost theatrical cheerfulness. A broad grin stretched her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, hidden as they were. "I'm a friend of your dad, Ella." Despite her reassurances, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I'd watched enough dramatic films with my mother, curled up on our soft chenille sofa, to know that those who insisted too loudly on their harmlessness often weren't. There was something about her, the slightly too bright lipstick, the way her perfume, heavy and sweet, reached me even from a few feet away, that felt dissonant, out of place in my quiet world. "I know it's you, Ella, because look." She rummaged through a large, ostentatiously patterned handbag, its clasps glinting. Her nails, long and painted a startling shade of crimson, seemed impossibly impractical for everyday tasks. She pulled out a smartphone, its case as garish as her purse, and turned the screen towards me. My breath caught in my throat. It was a photo of me, beaming, flanked by my mother and father at my first communion. My mother's gentle hand was on my shoulder, my father's arm around her waist. It was the exact same photograph I had as the wallpaper on my own phone. A private, cherished moment, now displayed on a stranger's device. How? A cold tendril of confusion and fear curled around my heart. "Wondering why I have this," she continued, her laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. "It's not strange at all. Your dad gave it to me." She paused, then introduced herself with a flourish. "You can call me Roxy." And then, just as abruptly as she'd appeared, she delivered a peculiar message, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell your mom, tell her Roxy said she should give your dad up quickly. He deserves to be happy, you know." With another bright, meaningless smile, she turned and walked away, her high heels clicking decisively on the pavement, leaving me standing there, a bewildered 13-year-old with a message that felt like a stone in my hand. When I reached home, the familiar scent of cinnamon and apples greeted me from the kitchen. My mother, Clara, her soft brown hair tied back loosely, her face lit with that welcoming smile I cherished, was humming as she pulled a pie from the oven. Looking at her, at the peaceful sanctuary of our home, the words Roxy had spoken seemed too ugly, too jarring to voice. So, I kept silent. I buried the encounter deep within me, hoping it was just a bizarre, isolated incident, a strange dream I might forget. On the surface, life in our house on Maple Street continued its gentle rhythm. My father, Julian, remained, to all outward appearances, the kind, devoted family man I had always known. He was still chasing his dream of becoming a playwright, his evenings often spent at the little community theater downtown, or hunched over his desk in the study, surrounded by stacks of paper and the scent of old books. He'd read his lines aloud with passion, his voice filling the house, and I'd often found myself captivated by the worlds he tried to create. Yet, beneath the surface of our everyday interactions, that heavy, cold lump settled permanently in my heart, a silent, unwilling witness to an unresolved tension, a question mark hanging over the portrait of our perfect family. I transitioned from elementary to middle school, then began the journey toward high school. My parents continued to attend school events, smiling for photographs, presenting a united front. To anyone looking in, we were the epitome of a normal, happy family. But I couldn't shake off the feeling, a persistent, quiet hum beneath the melody of our lives, that something was profoundly amiss. The vibrant, unsettling image of Roxy, her strange words, and the shared photograph remained a closely guarded secret, a seed of doubt that had taken root in my young soul. Time, in its relentless way, flowed onward. Shortly after I started high school, a shadow fell over our family, a shadow far more tangible and threatening than the one Roxy had cast. My mother, Clara, fell ill. It began subtly, a persistent tiredness, a lingering cough, but soon escalated into something serious, a condition that the doctors, with kind but solemn faces, explained would likely cut her life cruelly short. "It's not a lie, Ella," she told me one afternoon, her voice a soft echo of its former strength, a faint, brave smile gracing her lips as she lay propped against the pillows in her bed, the sunlight from the window illuminating the new fragility in her features. "I won't be around much longer, my love." Through all of this, through the hushed conversations and the scent of antiseptic that began to cling to our home, I kept my childhood worries about Roxy and my father to myself. I clung to the desperate hope that the incident by the school gate had been a misunderstanding, a cruel, meaningless joke played by a stranger. But the weight of that secret, combined with the crushing reality of my mother's illness, pressed heavily on me, shaping my young life in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. One quiet evening, as the twilight painted our living room in hues of lavender and rose, Mom called me to her side. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm despite her weakness. "Ella, my dearest," she began, her eyes, clear and filled with an almost unbearable tenderness, searching mine. "There's something important I need to discuss with you. I have a feeling, a strong feeling that after I'm no longer here, things might get tough for you." Unfairly so. A shiver traced its way down my spine. Her words were gentle, yet they carried an undercurrent of urgency, of a truth she needed me to grasp. "To ensure you can stand on your own 2 feet, my brave girl, I'll do everything in my power to prepare you. You need to be able to live independently, Ella. Truly independently." Her gaze drifted towards the window, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It seems she doesn't envision a future where you're living with your father, or just the 2 of us," I thought, the unspoken words hanging in the air between us. Perhaps she sensed something more deeply than I did, something about Julian, my father, that went beyond my own vague unease. I had always suspected as much, a quiet, intuitive knowing that mirrored my own, yet I found myself unable to ask her directly. It felt like a betrayal of the fragile peace we were trying to maintain. It seemed Mom thought I was already aware, on some level, but chose not to discuss it explicitly, perhaps to shield me, or perhaps because the words themselves were too painful. "When the time comes," she continued, her voice soft but resolute, "you may face challenges that you dislike, choices that feel forced upon you. But I hope you'll understand, my sweet girl, that everything I do, everything I've set in motion, is for your sake. For your future, your strength." I could only nod, a lump forming in my throat, my eyes stinging. "Yeah, Mom," I managed to whisper. "I understand." A look of profound relief softened her features. She pulled me into a tight hug, her frail arms wrapping around me. "Thank you, Ella. Thank you, my brave, understanding daughter." Afterward, we didn't speak much more about it. We slipped back into the rhythm of our days, pretending, in a way, that everything was normal. The four of us, me, Mom, me, Dad, and the unspoken weight of what was to come continued living as if our world wasn't slowly tilting on its axis. The only discernible change was that Mom grew progressively weaker. Her trips to the hospital became more frequent, her stays longer, until one gray, sorrowful day, she couldn't return home to Maple Street anymore. During those harrowing months, my father, Julian, was a constant presence by her side, at least in body. He would rush to the hospital after his day at Ashworth Publishing, a position my maternal grandfather, Charles Ashworth, had arranged for him years ago. He'd often come home early to cook simple meals and manage the household, always ensuring, with a kind of meticulous, almost theatrical efficiency, that everything was taken care of. To any outsider looking in, Julian Willoughby was the perfect husband, the devoted father, bearing his sorrow with quiet dignity. Yet, something in his demeanor felt rehearsed. There was a precision to his grief, a carefully curated concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I made your favorite pasta, Ella. How does it taste?" he would ask, his voice modulated with just the right amount of gentle inquiry. "It's delicious, Dad," I would reply, forcing a smile. "You're a great cook, but I miss Mom's shepherd's pie. I hope she can cook for us again soon." My voice would trail off, the longing for her, for the true warmth she brought to our home, an ache in my chest. We played our roles within the family drama, maintaining a facade of unity and hope. I sensed that both Mom and I knew, in our own ways, that much of it was an act, a carefully constructed performance designed to keep her final days as peaceful as possible. So, we went along with it, navigating the currents of unspoken truths and carefully chosen words. That's how we spent our time, simply passing the days, suspended in a state of mutual, loving pretense. For years later, when I was in my third year of high school, just shy of my 16th birthday, my mother, Clara, passed away. The world tilted, then shattered. Losing her was a profound, visceral heartbreak, a pain so deep and encompassing it felt as though a part of my own soul had been extinguished. It's a sorrow only understood by those who have walked that shadowed path. At the wake and the funeral, held in the old stone church where my parents had married, Julian played the grieving husband flawlessly. His tears mirrored mine, yet as I watched him accept condolences, his face a mask of sorrow, his words of loss eloquent and moving, they felt hollow, like beautifully delivered lines from one of his plays. The attendees, friends of my mother, colleagues of my father, members of our Havenwood community, expressed their heartfelt condolences, their eyes often welling with tears for the bereaved father and his young daughter. Alone, after the services, when the scent of lilies and sorrow still hung heavy in the air, many well-meaning acquaintances and distant relatives pulled me aside, their voices soft with sympathy, advising me to stay strong, to lean on my father, to navigate this new, fractured reality together. But Mom and I had made a promise, sealed with that tight hug in the twilight of our living room. I needed to forge my own path, to stand on my own. Her words about independence, about preparing for challenges, echoed in my mind, a guiding light in the sudden, overwhelming darkness. As expected, perhaps even anticipated by my mother, Julian's presence at home dwindled rapidly after the period of formal mourning. "Dad's incredibly busy with work at the publishing house, Ella," he would say, his voice tinged with a feigned weariness, justifying his increasingly frequent absences. "And there are commitments, things I must attend to." Dinners became solitary affairs, the house on Maple Street growing quieter, filled only with the echo of my own footsteps. "You're a big girl now, practically an adult," he'd add with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You can manage on your own for a bit, can't you?" And so, I was left to face most days by myself. It was tough, tougher than I had anticipated, even with my mother's careful preparations. A part of me, the young, hopeful part, had secretly wished that perhaps, just perhaps, my father would draw closer, would show more genuine concern for me after Mom's passing. That our shared loss might bridge the subtle chasm that had always existed between us. But that was not to be. At 15, caught in that liminal space between being an adult and a child, I gradually, painfully, adapted to the solitude, the quiet hum of the empty house becoming a familiar, if unwelcome, companion. Then, 1 month after Mom's memorial service, when the raw edges of grief had just begun to soften into a dull ache, something unexpected shattered the fragile peace I was trying to build. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was in my room, sorting through some of Mom's old gardening journals, the scent of pressed lavender and old paper clinging to the pages, a small comfort. Suddenly, a commotion from downstairs, loud voices, the thud of heavy objects caught my attention. First, clear out all these unnecessary vintage items, then we'll organize what's left, I heard Julian's voice, sharp and commanding, directing a group of men. Confused and alarmed, I hurried down the stairs. The sight that greeted me sent a shockwave through my already bruised heart. Strangers, burly men in overalls, were in our living room, starting to carry out boxes. My mother's cherished collection of first edition poetry books, each one carefully chosen by her own mother, Grandma Eleanor, over decades, and the hand-stitched quilts, heirlooms crafted by my great-grandmother, their colors faded with time but rich with family history, they were being moved. "What's happening?" I cried out, my voice trembling. "Dad, why are you moving Mom's things?" To my utter dismay, the workers, under Julian's explicit instructions, were systematically removing my mother's most treasured belongings. These weren't just objects, they were tangible pieces of her, of our family's story, imbued with love and memory. "No. Don't take those away," I protested, my voice rising in desperation. I instinctively moved to block the doorway, my small frame a flimsy barrier against their determined advance. They were just movers, of course, doing their job, following the orders of the man who paid them. "Ella, your mother's not here to use these anymore, so I'm having them moved," Julian explained, his tone shockingly nonchalant, almost casual. There was a glint in his eye, a subtle, almost imperceptible curl to his lip, as if he relished the upheaval, the erasure. Desperately, I resisted, planting myself firmly in the entrance, my arms outstretched. "What are you planning to do with these things?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rising anger. "These books, these quilts, they were Grandma Eleanor's gifts to Mom. They're priceless to us. Items that can be sold will be sold, the rest will be discarded," Julian declared, his tone detached, his gaze sweeping over the precious heirlooms as if they were mere clutter. He spoke as though he intended to casually dispose of something sacred, something irreplaceable. These were not just my mother's bridal trousseau, crafted and collected with such love by my wealthy maternal grandparents, the Ashworths. They were the very heart of our family's heritage, each piece holding stories, whispers of generations past. As I pleaded with the movers, explaining the sentimental, historical, and personal value of each item, how my grandmother had painstakingly curated the book collection for my mother, how my great-grandmother's hands had stitched every pattern into the quilts, an intrigued, slightly amused voice chimed in from behind Julian. My, what have we here? Quite the vintage collection." I turned, my heart sinking with a dreadful sense of recognition. It was Roxy. Or, as I now knew her, Sylvia Dubois. She was older than when I'd first seen her, lines etched faintly around her eyes, but her hair was still that startling platinum blonde, her attire just as flamboyant. She brushed past me as if I were invisible, her eyes greedily scanning the books and quilts. "These are rather lovely, aren't they, Julian? Quite the find. I think I could definitely use these." Despite my anguished pleas, the movers continued their work, hefting a crate of books. It was only when Sylvia, with a dismissive flick of her wrist, said, "Oh, all right, perhaps put those particular ones back for now, dear. We can sort through them later," that my father instructed the men to return the items to the house, albeit temporarily. The casual authority in Sylvia's voice, the way my father immediately deferred to her, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through me. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "who is she? Why is she here, telling you what to do with Mom's things?" Julian turned to me, a smirk playing on his lips, a look so alien, so cruel, it barely seemed to belong to the father I thought I knew. "Ella," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth, "this is Sylvia. Sylvia Dubois. And she is going to be my new wife. Your new stepmother." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Stepmother. His wife. So soon. The casual discarding of my mother's memory, her cherished belongings, all for this woman. I felt a surge of nausea, of profound, unutterable betrayal. I stammered, shaking my head, backing away. "No. I won't accept her. Not in this house. Not ever." Julian's smirk widened into something predatory. "Oh, really?" he drawled. "And what are you going to do about it, Ella? You're just a child. You can't live on your own. If you can't accept Sylvia, then perhaps you're the one who should find somewhere else to be." It was too much. The callousness, the blatant disregard for my mother, for me. Sylvia, meanwhile, feigned a wounded expression, placing a hand dramatically on her chest. "Julian, darling, perhaps she just needs time. But honestly, after such disrespect, I don't know if I can feel comfortable here unless she apologizes." An apology? To her? For defending my mother's memory in my own home? A cold, hard resolve solidified within me. "I will never apologize to her," I stated, my voice surprisingly steady, "and I will not live under the same roof as her." To my astonishment, Julian's response was immediate and shocking. "Fine," he snapped, his charming facade crumbling to reveal the impatient, selfish man beneath. "If you can't accept Sylvia, then you should leave. Go on. Pack your things." He clearly expected me to break down, to plead, to eventually submit. But my mother's words, her careful preparations, echoed in my mind. "To ensure you can stand on your own 2 feet, you may face challenges that you dislike." This was it. This was the challenge. Taking a deep breath, I looked him straight in the eye, then at Sylvia, whose expression flickered with surprise. "All right," I said, my voice calm, almost serene. "I will." The shock on both their faces was almost comical. They had anticipated tears, hysterics, a teenage tantrum. They hadn't anticipated quiet agreement. I turned without another word and walked up the stairs to my room. There wasn't much left to pack, truth be told. In the weeks following Mom's funeral, guided by a premonition I couldn't quite name but which now felt like my mother's prescient wisdom, I had slowly, discreetly moved my most important belongings, my journals, photographs, clothes, and small, irreplaceable keepsakes from Mom to my grandparents' house in the nearby countryside town of Oakhaven. I gathered the last of my things, a few books, toiletries, the framed photo of Mom and me from my last birthday into a small suitcase. Then, I walked back downstairs. Julian and Sylvia were standing in the hallway, whispering agitatedly. They fell silent as I approached. I looked at my father, the man who had once read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride my bike, and felt a profound, aching sadness, not for myself, but for the image of him that had just irrevocably shattered. "From this moment on," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "we are strangers. You have made your choice. And I am making mine." Without waiting for a reply, I walked out of the front door of the house on Maple Street, the house that had once been filled with love and laughter, and didn't look back. I called a taxi, and as it drove away from Havenwood, towards the sprawling gardens and comforting embrace of my grandparents' home in Oakhaven, a sense of quiet liberation settled over me. Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Charles welcomed me with open arms and tears in their eyes. They listened, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow and a grim, unsurprised understanding, as I recounted what had happened. "Oh, my poor girl," Grandma Eleanor murmured, stroking my hair. "We always feared Julian wasn't, well, we feared his character was not as strong as your mother deserved. But this is beyond deceitful." Grandpa Charles, a man of few words but deep integrity, simply nodded, his jaw tight with anger. "You are home now, Ella," he said, his voice a balm to my wounded spirit. "You are safe here. Reflecting on the whirlwind of the past few years, I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude for my mother. She had seen this coming, in some way. She had prepared me for independence, teaching me to cook, to manage household tasks, to think for myself, from a remarkably young age. Despite her passing, and despite Julian's callous abandonment, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would manage. Thanks to her foresight, her unwavering love, I was not alone. A month after I had moved into the tranquil embrace of my grandparents' home in Oakhaven, a haven of rose gardens and sun-dappled lawns, Julian began to try and contact me. His calls came sporadically at first, then with increasing frequency, dozens of them lighting up my phone screen. I ignored them all. I knew, with a chilling certainty that belied my years, that any attempt to reach out was likely driven by self-interest, not genuine paternal concern. This new chapter of my life, though undeniably bittersweet, born from loss and betrayal, was a testament to my mother's enduring foresight and her fierce, protective love. I often turned off my phone when I left for school, leaving it behind in the quiet sanctuary of my new room, a sun-filled attic space overlooking the gardens. Even after returning home, I didn't immediately check it, preferring the peace of my books or a walk with Grandpa Charles among his beloved trees. It was only late one evening, after a long, soothing bath scented with lavender and chamomile, just as I was about to slip into bed, that I finally picked up my phone. To my utter surprise, the screen glowed with an almost comical number of notifications, over 100 missed calls. My phone had evidently been ringing off the hook, vibrating silently on my nightstand throughout the day. With a sigh, I decided to answer, assuming it might be one of my school friends. The moment I connected the call, an irate, unfamiliar male voice burst through the speaker, so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Hello, Ella. Is that you? Why on earth didn't you pick up sooner? Do you have any idea how many times I've called?" The tone was incredibly rude, abrupt, and laced with an aggressive impatience. I chose not to respond, a sudden stillness settling over me. The voice continued, a note of frustration creeping in. "Hello, Ella? Can you hear me? Why are you being silent?" Still, I remained quiet, listening to the strained breathing on the other end of the line. Then, with a hint of dawning, uncomfortable realization, the voice softened, taking on a wheedling, almost unctuous quality. "Ella. It's Dad. It's Julian. You haven't forgotten my voice, have you, sweetheart?" I wish I could forget, I thought, a wave of weariness washing over me. But aloud, I remained silent, a wall of carefully constructed composure. "Ella, please, you have to help me. I'm in serious trouble." His pleading tone was almost sickening, a grotesque parody of fatherly concern. "You wouldn't turn away from your own father when he needs you, would you? We're family." I finally spoke, my voice calm, detached, echoing the words I had spoken that day I left Maple Street. "I'm sorry," I said, my tone polite but firm. "I believe you have the wrong number. I don't have a father by that name. Not anymore." There was a stunned pause on the other end. Then he persisted, his voice cracking with feigned desperation. "Ella, it's me, your dad. Please, can't you help me? Think of your family. Think of what your mother would want." The mention of my mother, used so callously as a tool for manipulation, ignited a spark of cold anger within me. As I've said before, I retorted, my voice unwavering, "You're mistaken. Please double-check the number you're dialing." With that, I ended the call and switched off my phone, placing it face down on the nightstand. I resolved then and there that the man who used to be my father would not disturb the fragile peace I was painstakingly building for myself ever again. The very next day, a sleek, unfamiliar car pulled up the long, gravel driveway of my grandparents' Oakhaven estate. Julian and Sylvia Dubois emerged, their expressions a mixture of aggression and entitlement. "Let us see Ella," Julian demanded, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn to where Grandma Eleanor and I were tending her prize-winning roses. "You must have poisoned her mind against us. She's our daughter. Send her home immediately." Sylvia stood beside him, nodding emphatically, her arms crossed, a look of petulant indignation on her face. But my mother, Clara, in her quiet wisdom, had foreseen even this. Before her passing, with the gentle but firm guidance of her own father, Grandpa Charles, and our family solicitor, Mr. Alastair Finch, she had legally transferred the ownership of all her properties, including the family home on Maple Street, a home originally gifted to her by my grandparents upon her marriage, directly to me. Aware of her terminal illness, she had acted swiftly and discreetly, ensuring all necessary taxes were paid, but she had not informed Julian. He had, it seemed, continued to believe he held significant influence, if not outright ownership, over the property. His current state of panic was, therefore, entirely understandable, if utterly misdirected. With Mr. Finch acting as my guardian and legal counsel, we issued a formal eviction notice to Julian and Sylvia. The notice clearly stated that they had 1 month to vacate the premises on Maple Street or face further legal action. It also meticulously listed all household belongings, which I had carefully documented with photographs before my departure, as my legal property, warning that any damages or missing items would be met with claims for full compensation. About 10 days later, Julian responded, not with compliance, but with a challenge. His lawyer presented a will, purportedly my mother's, claiming that all her assets, including the house, were left solely to him. However, this was an outdated will, one my mother had drafted shortly after her initial diagnosis, in a moment of emotional vulnerability, perhaps still clinging to a sliver of hope for Julian's character. In stark contrast, Mr. Finch and I held a newer, meticulously dated will, signed by my mother just the day before she passed away. In this final testament, she left everything unequivocally to me and had formally entrusted my care and guardianship to my grandparents, Charles and Eleanor Ashworth, thereby ensuring that Julian would have no legal custody or claim over me or her estate. Our response to his lawyer was swift and clear. The newer will, by its very existence and date, rendered the previous one entirely invalid. Despite his initial bluster and attempts to challenge this, it was abundantly clear that my mother's final, considered wishes were for me to inherit everything and for Julian to have no further part in my life or legacy. Days after our firm legal response, a different lawyer, one Mr. Harrison, representing Julian, reached out to Mr. Finch. He claimed there had been a terrible misunderstanding and pleaded for an urgent meeting, suggesting a path to amicable resolution. But by then, the lines had been drawn too clearly. The trust, whatever remnants might have lingered, had been irrevocably shattered. It was far too late for any genuine reconciliation. The story Julian had spun to Mr. Harrison was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. He had apparently concealed the entire saga of Sylvia, the attempted disposal of my mother's heirlooms, and his ultimatum that led to my departure. According to Julian's tearful account to his new lawyer, I had inexplicably and quietly moved to my grandparents' home and had since refused all contact. During his aggressive visit to Oakhaven, he alleged that my grandparents had hysterically called the police, a blatant lie. Grandpa Charles had calmly but firmly asked them to leave his property, and denied him any visitation, expressing profound fear that I was being held against my will and brainwashed. Desperate and choked with emotion, he had apparently pleaded with Mr. Harrison, emphasizing that I was still underage and that he couldn't fathom my decision to be adopted by my grandfather, another distortion, as formal adoption proceedings hadn't even begun, without his, the loving father's, permission. He insinuated that my elderly, perhaps manipulative, grandparents had misled me with falsehoods about him, and that I, in my grief-stricken and vulnerable state, had tragically believed their deceit. "She is my cherished daughter, Ella," he had reportedly implored, tears streaming down his face, "the only precious child my beloved Clara left behind. You must help me get her back. I fear for her well-being." Observing Julian recount his fabricated worries with such theatrical tears was, Mr. Harrison later admitted to Mr. Finch, initially quite challenging for him. He remarked on the profound confusion I must be feeling after losing my mother, noting that Julian, too, had lost his beloved wife and perhaps hadn't been there for me as he should have been in his own grief. This, Mr. Harrison had surmised, might be the reason for his overwrought emotional display. But I couldn't help but wonder about the true source of his dramatic flair, recalling his long-held aspirations to be a playwright, his natural inclination towards performance. I remembered a moment at my mother's deathbed, a scene he had orchestrated with solemn gravity, where she had weakly asked Julian to look after me. He had taken her hand, his voice thick with emotion, promising to cherish and protect me always. My grandparents, initially deeply skeptical of Julian throughout his marriage to my mother, had been visibly moved by that display. I, however, even then, had felt a strange detachment, witnessing no genuine warmth in that carefully crafted gesture, only the echo of lines well rehearsed. During a subsequent meeting between Mr. Finch and Mr. Harrison, at which I was present with Grandpa Charles, I calmly presented a small digital voice recorder. On it was a recording I had discreetly made on my phone that chaotic Saturday morning the movers had come to our house, the sounds of Julian's callous dismissal of my mother's belongings, his sharp orders, Sylvia's greedy pronouncements, and finally, his cruel ultimatum to me. As Mr. Harrison listened, his expression shifted from professional concern to visible discomfort, then to a dawning, grim understanding. Julian's carefully constructed facade of the grieving, concerned father crumbled into dust with every replayed word. It was starkly, undeniably evident that Julian Willoughby had been performing all along, his life a stage, his emotions mere props. Mr. Harrison, a man of evident professional integrity, apologized profusely to me, to my grandfather, and to Mr. Finch for the grievous misunderstanding and the distress Julian's actions had caused. He later informed Mr. Finch that he had not only refused Julian's request to represent him further but had also billed him substantially for breach of contract, citing the deliberate misrepresentation of facts and the blatant lies Julian had told him about the circumstances surrounding my situation and my mother's estate. The deeper, more painful truth, the one that had cast long shadows over my mother's life, stemmed from her past. As a young, impressionable woman, barely out of her teens, Clara Ashworth, daughter of the respected owner of Ashworth Publishing House, had fallen deeply, romantically in love with Julian Willoughby. He was older, charming, a budding playwright with a magnetic stage presence in Havenwood's small amateur theater group. Despite their age difference and his decidedly unsteady career prospects, they eventually married. The union came with a significant stipulation from my grandparents, Charles and Eleanor. My mother, as their sole daughter and heiress to a significant family legacy, would retain her Ashworth surname, and any children would carry it as well, or as a hyphenated name. Julian had readily agreed, perhaps seeing it as a small price for entry into a world of comfort and influence. After the wedding, Julian largely abandoned his theatrical pursuits, at least professionally, and accepted a position at Ashworth Publishing. This, however, did little to earn my grandfather Charles's genuine trust, who always harbored a quiet skepticism about Julian's motives. Over time, Julian's true colors, his inherent self-interest and capacity for deceit, began to show more clearly, at least to those who were willing to see. I might have continued to believe, for a little longer, that he was simply a flawed but ultimately wonderful father, if not for the gradual uncovering of his long-standing affair with Sylvia Dubois, a woman with minor roles in the same local theater circles he'd once frequented, who mistakenly believed she could usurp my mother's place, her status, her life. The full, heartbreaking reality was revealed through a series of letters and journal entries my mother had written, addressed to my grandparents but discovered by me amongst her private papers after her death. These writings painted a poignant picture of her growing suspicions about Julian's fidelity, years before her illness. Despite once adoring him, her sharp intuition, coupled with increasingly careless behavior on his part, led her to uncover his deceit and multiple infidelities. Though she discovered whispers and even outright statements from former acquaintances of Julian that he was only with her for her family's wealth and status, she had clung desperately to the hope of a happy family life, especially after my birth. She had tried, with quiet strength and dignity, to preserve the sanctity of our home, perhaps for my sake. Yet, as I pieced together the fragments of her hidden pain, it became devastatingly clear that the man I had called father, the man who had presented himself as a caring husband and devoted parent, was merely a skilled playwright of his own life, concealing his true motives, his infidelities, and his profound selfishness behind a meticulously crafted mask of familial devotion. By the time my mother fell ill, they had, in their own quiet, unspoken ways, reached a point where they had little left to lose or give to each other. Their resignation to their grim prospects, the slow erosion of their marriage, was palpable in her later writings. Yet, I was now prepared to take legal action to protect what was mine, what my mother had ensured was mine, and Julian and Sylvia were well aware of my unwavering stance. The day I first met Sylvia Dubois outside my school, when I was just 13, marked a turning point, not just in my perception, but legally. Her attempt to coerce my mother into giving up Julian by making her presence known directly to me, a child, was a calculated, cruel move. In legal terms, as Mr. Finch patiently explained, this could be construed as deliberate interference with custody and infliction of emotional distress upon a minor. It became feasible to seek compensation from a mistress who actively attempts to alienate a parent from their young child or disrupt a family unit in such a direct manner. Sylvia, when confronted with this possibility through legal channels, vehemently denied any such malicious intentions, claiming she was merely concerned and misunderstood. However, unknown to her at the time, my mother, alerted by my distress after that first encounter, had quietly hired a discreet private investigator. This investigator had managed to document not only Sylvia's approach to me but also several other instances of her attempting to insert herself into our family life, creating a pattern of harassment. The video recording of her at the school gate, her words to me, became damning evidence. Sylvia pleaded for mercy through her own hastily acquired, and clearly outmatched, legal counsel. She implored me, through them, not to pursue legal action, citing potential damage to her budding career and reputation. But my resolve, forged in grief and a newfound understanding of my mother's quiet suffering, was firm. The ensuing lawsuit, though focused on damages for emotional distress rather than criminal charges, exposed Sylvia Dubois's misconduct publicly within Havenwood's relatively small, interconnected community. This led to her swift dismissal from the prestigious local theater company where she held minor roles and occasionally worked as a hostess for their fundraising events. The company, known for its philanthropic backing from prominent local families like the Ashworths, prioritized its reputation highly and could not risk associating with someone embroiled in such a tawdry scandal. When faced with the choice, they asked her to resign quietly, or face a more public termination. Sylvia even threatened, in a fit of bluster, to countersue me for defamation, but I, advised by Mr. Finch, dismissed her threats. We had truth and evidence on our side. Ultimately, she refrained from suing and left the theater company, severely limiting her future employment prospects in any high-end or reputable venues in Havenwood or beyond. The lawsuit itself is still technically underway, a slow-moving process, but winning it, for me, is not about significant financial gain. Vindication for my mother, and for the distress caused to me, is my primary goal. I refuse to let them off easily. My determination, like my mother's quiet strength, is unwavering. Meanwhile, Julian's professional life crumbled with astonishing speed. He had secured his comfortable, well-paying position at Ashworth Publishing solely through nepotism, a reluctant concession by my grandfather Charles to my mother's initial pleas years ago. His status as the son-in-law of the owner had shielded him from criticism and scrutiny for years, regardless of his actual performance or actions, which, it turned out, were mediocre at best. However, the rapidly spreading scandal being effectively ousted from his home by his own teenage daughter, the public exposure of his long-standing affair with Sylvia, and the subsequent legal battles over my mother's estate stripped away that protective veneer. His true incompetence, which had been previously overshadowed by his charming facade and skilled pretense of capability, was laid bare for all his colleagues to see. It became painfully evident that his only real talent was in acting, in pretending to be something he was not. His reputation within the close-knit business community of Havenwood was irreversibly tarnished, leading to universal disdain from colleagues and clients alike. Despite his attempts to remain inconspicuous, to weather the storm, the workplace became too hostile, the whispers too loud, the silent judgment too heavy. Within a few months, he was forced to tender his resignation from Ashworth Publishing. He now resides in a modest, rented apartment on the outskirts of Havenwood with Sylvia, their dreams of grandeur and easy living apparently dissolving. Occasionally, he still attempts to reach out, usually through third parties, hinting at financial difficulties and seeking assistance, but our relationship has dissolved into something less than mere acquaintanceship, marked on my side by a quiet, settled disdain. I have no inclination to help. Their choices, and the consequences thereof, are theirs alone. In another incident, during the brief period Sylvia had access to the Maple Street house before the eviction notice took full effect, she had, in a fit of pique or sheer carelessness, damaged several of my mother's first edition poetry books, tearing pages, spilling coffee on irreplaceable bindings. Upon discovering this, I, through Mr. Finch, demanded full compensation for the restoration and diminished value. They complied, paying a significant sum, likely using what remained of Julian's severance pay or perhaps even accruing debt. Their financial situation, however, is of no concern to me. I have severed those ties, making it clear that their path is their own to navigate. I am now legally adopted by my grandfather, Charles Ashworth. It hasn't changed much in our day-to-day lives. He has always been more of a father to me than Julian ever truly was, but the legal formality brought a sense of closure, of belonging, of solid ground beneath my feet. As I prepare to embark on a new adventure, studying abroad during my final years of high school at a wonderful school in the rolling hills of Tuscany, a place my mother had always dreamed of visiting, I reflect often on her incredible foresight. She ensured I wouldn't face language barriers, enrolling me in Italian lessons from a young age, telling me it was the language of art and sunshine. She equipped me not just with skills, but with a resilient spirit, an ability to adapt and thrive wherever life might take me. I am poised to embrace a future that I hope will meet, and perhaps even exceed, my mother's deepest hopes for me. I am eager to absorb the diverse experiences that await me abroad, to learn, to grow, and perhaps, one day, to meet someone who will love me for who I am, with a love that is true, steadfast, and kind. This, in its own bittersweet way, has been the most profound lesson my mother's own story, her quiet strength in the face of her own disillusionment, has taught me. As I think this, sitting here with her photograph on my desk, a candid shot of her laughing, her eyes sparkling with joy on a summer holiday years ago, the mother in the photograph seems to smile, a gentle, almost sheepish acknowledgement, as if to say, yes, my love. That's exactly it. And in that imagined smile, I find a universe of peace.